Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Financial Services has conveyed an SOS. Hence the amendments to the amendments of the main amendments. I have no quarrel to pick with the Minister over the amendments, but certainly government has a lot to answer for. It's a race against time. It's a fight for survival. We have to survive and thrive. Global business as a strategic sector impacts directly upon the economy, especially on the balance of payment. What is our objective? The objective is to be removed from the grey list and the EU blacklist, and to be what we used to be, a financial low-tax jurisdiction of repute, and hopefully to be the international financial center of the region. Let us look at the issues which we need to address and which have been addressed to some extent. What we call ineffectiveness. And if ineffectiveness is addressed by 5 strategic deficiencies identified by the Financial Action Task Force and the European Union. The amendments to the Anti-Money Laundering and Combating Financing Terrorism Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2020 are not extensive, but rather serve the purpose of increasing fines and reinforcing the anti-money laundering and combating financing of terrorism provisions the country was supposed to already have implemented. The only strategic deficiency which has been addressed forcefully is the ultimate beneficiary ownership. Implementation remains the key master, and implementation of the law is the master key. Mr. Speaker, we can turn things around, but for some time this strategic sector has to expect more turbulence. When will our jurisdiction be removed from the unwanted list? Not until next year, and the worst period will be from the month of October to beginning of May. And I'm not the one who said it. That was clearly spelled out by the European Commission. As long as we pose a threat to the EU financial system, we will not come out of the woods. And the best way to make good use of the assistance dispensed to us by the European Union and Germany, which is, of course, the powerhouse of the European Union, is to recruit the best from home and overseas to head or to assist the effectiveness of law enforcement agencies. The Minister considered on Radio France International that nothing came out of the phone conversation between Prime Minister and Mr. Charles Michel, chairperson of the EU Council. There are indeed miles to go, and we have to narrow all the deficiencies in the anti-money laundering and combating of financing terrorism. I told the Prime Minister on the 11/6/20, in relation to P&Q on Saint-Louis power generation, that they are looking at a skid. It's a huge setback, and for a step forward, we have taken 2 steps backwards. Fraudulent and corrupt practices cannot be tolerated, and we need to have a culture of impunity if we want to sideline our critics. On June the 19th, the European Union announced that Mauritius would be added to the blacklist while they were removing Bosnia-Herzegovina, Ethiopia, Guyana, Laos, People's Democratic Republic, Sri Lanka, and Tunisia. Is Mauritius really worse off than those countries? EU, I agree with you, does act unilaterally, but we have ourselves to be blamed, first, due to delayed action to narrow the deficiencies, and two, because of poor political dialogue and lobbying. The placing of Mauritius on this list is not only a technical failing of the effectiveness of our controls, but more importantly, a political failing with regards to our diplomatic representation of the EU, which should have been aggressive and consistent. Instead, we let things slide and we have been distracted with internal politics, and the ministry has not done its duty. For the newly listed countries like Mauritius, the enhanced due diligence measures will apply from 1st October 2020 to make allowance for the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. Enhanced due diligence means high costs, tight scrutiny, and foreign portfolio investment will either go to Singapore or to Netherlands. Mr. Speaker, I read an article which was published, or rather a statement made by a fine economist, somebody who is well respected, the name of which I won't drop. But he spoke of the consequences of not addressing our deficiencies forcefully and effectively. Talk of balance of payment, the legacy that we are going to bequeath to the younger generation, of flight capital, depreciation of the rupee, reduced foreign investment. And these are issues that we need to address up front. Mr. Speaker, I said it when I intervened on the finance bill. If there is a sector where brain power rules the wave, it is the financial services sector. And there was a time, not too distant ago, when global business companies organized interviews with tertiary institutions to recruit young, promising graduates. As one prominent director told me, they not only do well, but are being trained to move from generics into the fields of specialization, equity, health management, wealth management, etc. We have the pool of young graduates, but we have to make sure that we harness our human resources. But unfortunately, this pool is overflowing and there's no gainful recruitment for reasons which are too obvious. How is it that a sector which had a growth rate of 12% and a direct and indirect workforce of 15,000 has come to standstill? And if the process is not reversed, we will go downhill. As matters stand, we are walking on slippery ground. It's not cool at all. Are we running out of steam, or has the model outlived its purpose? The approach has to be holistic. It's time to be proactive. But when I asked people in the sector and sought advice from them, the first thing that came to the mind, the manual handbook of the FSC, which is an important tool, but unfortunately has not been applicable as it should be. And in the meantime, due to poor institutional coordination, not a single week goes by that a scandal does not hit us in the face. The latest in the serial financial scandal relates to a German company which allegedly agreed to pay 300 million euro for an Indian business 1 week, only weeks after it changed hands for 37 million euro. That 2015 acquisition, which handed huge profits to a Mauritian intermediary, was and still is at the center of criticism from short sellers who question whether it was part of a giant fraud to inflate what we call the Wirecard sales and profit, which is a digital payment company. Mauritius has been in the news since 2015, mostly for the wrong reasons. There is one issue which I would like to highlight, because that was conveyed to me by those who are well-versed in the field, in the subject, the filing of suspicious transaction reporting, which has been reduced from 15 days to 5 working days, which to some of those who know best tell me that it's confusing and impractical. If this reporting period is reduced, is the FIU equipped to provide a response as well? Let me give you, Mr. Speaker, a shining example of suspicious transaction reporting. A lawyer enlisted by CEB was informed of fraudulent and corrupt practice in the presence of the then chairman of the CEB, failed to report the case, and this is a blatant case, and he's a blatant accomplice under Section 44 of the Prevention of Corruption Act. It is precisely the reason why we have to tread cautiously and err on the principle of caution. One has to understand that Mauritius is under constant watch, under constant gaze, and whatever we do has repercussion. So that's why I press upon government to see to it that corrective measures are taken to address issues which are relevant, to ensure that our reputation as a low-tax jurisdiction is not tarnished. And people know what's happening. I said it the other day, the African Bank Development has an observer status with Financial Action Task Force. And of course, they know precisely what has happened in Mauritius. We know what has been the findings of the Anti-Corruption and Integrity Department of African Bank Development. Prime Minister said that he's in the possession of a summary report, of the summary investigation report, but the fact remains that people who were very close to the former Deputy Prime Minister have failed to report a case of suspicious transaction reporting. They failed to report this. And this is a fact, this is obvious, this is striking, and we cannot run away from these harsh realities. So it's a sad day for a strategic sector which is being undermined by cronies of government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, hence the reason also as to why I put a PNQ to the Honourable Minister on the 13th of the month of May. And I put the question, answers were given, but let me remind him of one thing. Despite some recent progress made in correcting the anti-money laundering and combating financing of terrorism deficiency, Mauritius is still rated very poorly by the Financial Action Task Force, with 7 low effectiveness ratings out of 11 effectiveness outcome, as indicated on the ratings published on the Financial Action Task Force dated 13 February 2020. The Minister agrees that a country, that's what he said, if my memory serves me right, in the statement which he made, that a country with more than 6 low effectiveness outcome is deemed to have serious deficiency in its anti-money laundering, combating financing of terrorism system, and is put on the Financial Action Task Force grey list. As the Minister is aware, new Financial Action Task Force ratings are only given when it is assessed that sufficient progress has been made. And in its first anti-money laundering, combating financing of terrorism evaluation in 2007, Mauritius was rated non-compliant and partly compliant on less than 17 of the FATF 40 criteria, with only 3 non-compliant ratings. In 2018, Mauritius was rated non-compliant and partly compliant on more than 26 of the 40 criteria, with 13 non-compliant ratings. The minister has to agree that it is dishonest to argue that the previous Labour government is somewhat, together with our allies, is somewhat responsible for the dismal Financial Action Task Force ratings of Mauritius in 2018. Since the 2018 evaluation was based on a revised Financial Action Task Force principles of 2012, on the revised Financial Action Task Force methodology of 2013, and on the revised evaluation procedures established by ISAMLAG, the Financial Action Task Force regional body, only at the end of 2014. And what did the government do between 2015 to date? Of course, there's been amendments brought in a piecemeal manner. There have been amendments to amendments of the main amendments. But as I say, the success rests and resides in implementation of the amendments which are being brought. Mr. Speaker, let me look at one of the repercussions. And shortly after we appeared on the grey list established by the Financial Action Task Force, what happened to what impact did it have over on the Indian stock market? It fell. I'm talking of the week prior to it was on the 25th of February. And there was a report which published in Weekly and Weekly of India. Now, that was what the outcome was in respect of Mauritius being on the grey listing of FATF. The Indian stock market fell, and the Securities Exchange Board of India communique issued on that Tuesday makes mention of the inclusion of the Financial Action Task Force grey list and urges financial intermediaries to take account of the grey listing information of Mauritius in their risk analysis. A red flag indeed to financial intermediaries doing business with Mauritius, which will adversely affect investment in the global business sectors. And you know what was said? We joined the FATF grey list alongside of Pakistan. Mr. Speaker, the minister is surely aware that the Securities Exchange Board of India has denied foreign portfolio investors from Mauritius classification of Category 1 because Mauritius is not a FATF member. And this is to our detriment. It is to the detriment of the interests of the global business sector vis-à-vis our competitors. Let me now turn to diplomacy. And I said there's plenty of room for improvement at the level of economic diplomacy. As a desperate move, government has negotiated the exit of Ambassador Ghanesi from Public Service Commission to designate him as our ambassador to Brussels with a roving eye on the European Commission headquarters to safeguard our interests. It's good to recall that there was a lady who was a former member of the European Parliament and until 2019, who was a strong, and I'm sure still strong fighter for for the EU tax justice. And she was a person who hit very hard at Mauritius as being a low tax, not only as being a low tax jurisdiction, but of being a jurisdiction which, to a large extent, according to her, is a tax haven. But we interacted and made it a point to showcase Mauritius. We were fully engaged. And I must say at the time, of course, no one in government had the power to scan the eyes of any politically exposed person or doubtful character of the like of Sobrino to issue a certificate of good character. But things have moved on since Ambassador Ghanesi's golden days as a well-respected ambassador. And Brussels, and like Washington, is infested with lobbies. I have been told that the services of a reputed law firm in Paris has been enlisted. And one of the leading lawyers of the firm is a Mauritian, Mrs. Largesse, whose late father had nothing to do with the Sandwich political financial scandal which has rocked this government. Mr. Speaker, from grey list to blacklist, how did it happen and why did it happen? Let me remind our friends that recently, in respect of tax evasion of high net worth companies and persons from Europe. Now, there is a Danish bank operating in Estonia, and this bank, as a result of improper dealings, has turned over EU red and fuming with anger because of loss of revenue. And EU Parliament has introduced more stringent legislation to wage war on money laundering and financing of terrorism. EU member states, Council of Ministers, Commission, and Parliament will wield all powers to prevent evasion of taxes or laundering of money. Of course, EU will set more stringent rules, guidelines, and higher benchmark compared to those of Financial Action Task Force. The EU blacklist announced on the 7th of May 2020 comprises 22 countries, and Mauritius, of course, is well poised between Pakistan, Yemen, Zimbabwe, Panama, Botswana, amongst others. Unfortunately, and I have to say it, that to a large extent, the main culprit is this government. I agree, we don't have the clout that countries like Saudi Arabia have, irrespective of what the Saudi Crown Prince has committed. We know how they were removed from the blacklist, but I'm not saying that we have to punch above our weight. But we need to cluster and mobilize our strength and see to it that we work together with like-minded countries to put our case across very forcefully. I can understand why a little country like Vanuatu, which is light featherweight, is still on the blacklist as a jurisdiction. And the minister has to interface with like-minded. I know Minister of Foreign Affairs has done so. The Minister responsible for Financial Services have, via video conferencing, interface with like-minded person. But once our borders are open, the ministers have to cluster his strength, interface with our friends from ACP countries, go on a lobbying mission, set up a troika team, and if needs be, as I say, make an appeal to the European Union to come and depone before the Parliament, to convey strong signals as to measures being taken at institutional level to ward off threats and to be responsive to the outcomes given to us by Financial Action Task Force. We need, first and foremost, to meet criteria established by Financial Action Task Force, to get over what I call the qualifying exam, and then to come face to face with the European Union. But the signals have to be strong. We have to convey strong signals and impress upon the European Union that we are moving towards zero tolerance. But this is a daunting task for this government, and I don't expect this government to live up to the expectation of our people. But ultimately, we have to be responsible to those young people who are earning a decent living in the financial services sector. And as I said, this is a sector where there's no rent seeking, where there's no rent seeker. It's a sector which has empowered many young persons, enabled them to take the rung of the social and economic ladder. Mr. Speaker, make no mistake, no one owes us a living, and no one thinks that we are the most beautiful girl in town. Let me take the case of Trinidad and Tobago, which was not on the FATF list, obtained good marks from FATF in February 2020, but appeared on the blacklist established by the European Union. Even, as I said, if Mauritius lives up to the expectation of Financial Action Task Force and has good effectiveness rating, there is no guarantee that we will be removed from the EU list sooner than expected. Because the threshold is constantly being raised, and we have to live up to the expectation of our European friends. That's why we have to move towards zero tolerance. But by the look of things, I don't think that this government has the political will to overcome. Instead, it is being overwhelmed by scandals of what we call the political financial scandals. Mr. Speaker, as I said, the services of a law firm has been recruited. It's a positive signal, but you may recruit whoever you want. But if at domestic level, you don't become a showcase, as it used to be, when we had to defend the case of Mauritius in Abuja, because in the eyes of our African friends, the glass is either half full or half empty. But we have to convince them that the glass is half full and we can bring it to brimful. But to do so, we have to value what I call parity of esteem. We have no lessons to teach our African friends. And this is one of the fallacies of Mauritius, a bit too haughty. And we think that we are the navel of the world and everybody will gaze at us. Those days are gone. I recall when, like the minister, when he was Minister of Agro-Industry, I was spokesperson of the ACP on sugar. And Zambia made an appeal to us through the former chairman, through the former president who was on a state visit in Mauritius. Zambia has zero quota and is allocated a small quota only when there's a force majeure. They pleaded with us to allocate them a small quota. But then we were under undue pressure from Sugar Authority, from Plantation House, as if we were to concede an ounce of sugar. And if as minister I had conceded, and when I came back I would have been lynched by the press and probably the planters. But those days are gone. Either we are like-minded, we value our friendship, we are part of Africa, we turn our gaze towards Africa, get to know what Africa is, understand the culture of Africa, live with Africa, breathe Africa, we will be neither here nor there. And forever, they will terminate all our double taxation of Erdon Street. If we want to be partners, equal partners, there is something called equity. And when we talk of equity, that we are bound to share. Sharing of taxing rights. The problem with Mauritius wants to have everything. That's the problem with Mauritius. There comes a time when we have to say to ourselves, others also can make it. Others also can overtake us. Others can do better. But we cannot sit back, relax, enjoy armchair comfortability and say, we are the best. That's why we need to reinvent. We need to be more sophisticated, but more humane at the same time. And I appeal to this government to tread cautiously and not to take things for granted. We may come with the best legislation in the world, but if our law enforcement agencies are not enforcing, they are not enforcement, then what is the purpose of coming into this House with the best intention, but when it comes to implementation, we are neither here nor there. Mr. Speaker, let me tell the Minister that we need to accelerate the pace. We need to move fast, and we need to address those structural defects. And when we look back, I'm not going to refer to interview given by your predecessor, and he has been very active and elaborate in several newspapers. But la vérité aussi vient de ceux qui ne sont pas des anges. Maybe they are angels with a tight fist. But he said things which were relevant. And let me quote him. No, I won't quote him, but I'll refer to some other things he said. He blatantly accused the former CEO and chairman of FSC of running down the commission. And the former CEO has been propelled to the Bank of Mauritius despite extensive harm done to global business. He enjoyed the trappings of the CEO of the FSC and did nothing to pull the 170 business companies together and to constantly impress upon them that our jurisdiction has to measure all the risks, and we could not carry on simply ticking the box. Implementation, as I said, of legislative and institutional framework is still, unfortunately, a game for a laugh. It is the designated non-financial business and persons who are having a field day, unfortunately, at the expense of our dedicated professionals who are doing the best to maintain Mauritius as a center of repute. Let me also refer to amendments being brought to the gaming regulatory. But when we look in-house at what is happening at the Gaming Regulatory Authority, we have to ask one basic question. Is it a pawn? And we need to find out why Mrs. Ringadu, a decent person, had to resign as director. Who has given a license when COVID-19 was at its peak to be the sole master of fixed odd betting, to place bet from punters or racers or matchers organized and wherever in the world? And I've been told that the operator is operating illegally, as has no permit and franchise from respective countries, gambling authority, where bets are placed. Now, if Mauritius has become a heaven to tolerate people to go into illegal activities, what signals are we sending? What amendments are you bringing to this House? You think the world is not looking at us? The world has become a global village. Access to information is a right and no longer a privilege. Whatever we do, we cannot hide, and the truth certainly comes to the surface. So that's why I say, why should we do things which are illegal? This is not illegitimate, it's purely and simply illegal. So those gaming regulatory bodies overseas, you think they don't know what is happening? You think Mrs. Ringadu is a decent person who has been a victim of this government? You think people will stay quiet? And is this the way to recruit the best and to bring the best to head enforcement agencies? That's why I say we should not take risks. This is a sector where you can't say high risk, high reward. High risk means disaster for this sector. You have to assuage, to mitigate, to take low risk, and we have to move towards zero risk. Mr. Speaker, the reputation of Mauritius is at stake. And whatever we say, whatever we do, unless and until we become a country where there's rule of law, where there's decency, where there's democracy, where there's respect for human rights, then people will look up to us and at us. And we can laugh together. But under the circumstances, under the Prime Ministership of Mr. Pravin Jagnnath, this country is retreating. He may retreat, but as an opposition, we will not allow this country to surrender. We'll speak our mind, we'll highlight the shortcomings, we will tell government where the deficiencies are, and we will put our best endeavor to save a sector, a strategic sector, which has empowered so many young people. And they can rest assured of our full support. Thank you very much.